Good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to talk about something that almost no financial commentator is willing to say directly. Not because the information is classified, not because it requires a PhD to understand, but because the conclusion it leads to is one that a very large number of powerful institutions need you to never think about seriously. Here is that conclusion. America's worst nightmare is not a war, it is an invoice. Specifically, it is an oil invoice written in a currency that is not the dollar. And that invoice is already being drafted. Most people watching the Iran-Israel conflict right now are focused entirely on the wrong thing. They see missiles, they see airstrikes, they see the military exchange between two regional powers, and they assume the danger is measured in bombs and casualties. Those consequences are real, but they are not the consequences that will reshape your life, your savings, or the price of everything you buy. The weapon that matters most in this conflict is not sitting in a missile silo. It is sitting inside a financial system that most people do not know exists and have never heard of. It is called the petrodollar, and it is dying, not because of this war. The petrodollar was already terminally ill before the first strike was fired. The Iran-Israel conflict is not the cause of its decline. It is the accelerant, the match thrown into a room that was already full of gas. Today, we are going to do something the daily news coverage is not doing. We are going to examine the financial body underneath the military surface. We are going to look at the vital signs of a 50-year-old system that has governed the price of everything you own, everything you earn, and everything you spend. And we are going to explain precisely why a war being fought thousands of miles away may be the most important financial event of your lifetime. Before we can understand why the petrodollar is dying, we need to understand what it actually is, because most people have never heard the term, and even those who have rarely understand what it means in practice. The petrodollar is not a physical currency. There is no petrodollar bill in your wallet. It is an arrangement, a set of rules that governs how the most important commodity in the global economy gets bought and sold. That commodity is oil, and the rule is simple. If you want to buy oil on the international market, you must pay for it in dollars, not euros, not yuan, not gold, dollars. That single rule has consequences that ripple through every economy on the planet. Here is why. Every country that runs an industrial economy needs oil. Oil powers transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, electricity generation, and military logistics. Without it, modern civilization stops functioning within days. This means every country on Earth, regardless of its own currency, regardless of its own economic system, must hold a reserve of dollars simply to keep its economy operating. To buy oil, you need dollars. To get dollars, you need to earn them through trade, and the most reliable way to hold excess dollars safely is to invest them in dollar-denominated assets, primarily United States government bonds. This creates a feedback loop of extraordinary scale and durability. The entire world works, trades, and saves in a way that continuously generates demand for the American dollar and continuously finances the American government. It is not an accident. It was not a natural development of free markets. It was a deliberate construction, and it has given the United States an economic advantage over every other nation on Earth for more than 50 years. To understand how it was built, we need to go back to the moment when the dollar was in serious danger of losing its global position entirely. The year is 1971. The United States is in serious trouble. A decade of military involvement in Vietnam has drained the federal treasury. Inflation is rising, and President Nixon is facing a crisis that threatens to collapse the dollar's position at the center of the global economy. The problem is structural. Since 1944, the dollar had operated under a system called Bretton Woods. Every dollar in circulation was backed by a fixed quantity of gold. Foreign governments could present their dollars to the United States government and receive actual gold in return at a guaranteed rate. It was this gold backing that gave the dollar its credibility as the world's reserve currency. Nixon ended it. In August of 1971, he announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The gold window was closed permanently. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency, a piece of paper backed by nothing except the willingness of the world to keep accepting it. The immediate question was brutal and obvious. Why would the world keep accepting it? The answer came from the desert. Following 18 months of secret negotiations, senior American officials reached an agreement with the Saudi royal family in 1974. The terms were direct. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exports exclusively in dollars. Every barrel sold to every country in the world would be invoiced in American currency. In exchange, the United States would guarantee the military security of the Saudi regime and provide access to American weapons. The rest of the oil-producing cartel followed Saudi Arabia's lead within months. The petrodollar system was born, not through market forces, not through democratic agreement, through a deal made between two governments behind closed doors, a deal that every person on the planet would live inside for the next 50 years without ever being told it existed. Now consider what the petrodollar arrangement actually delivered for the United States. Economists call it the exorbitant privilege. And that phrase does not come close to capturing the scale of the advantage. Think about what it means when the entire world structurally needs your currency. Germany needs dollars to buy oil. Japan needs dollars to buy oil. India, South Korea, Brazil, Indonesia, every major economy on the planet needs dollars to keep their industries running. They earn those dollars through exports. They accumulate them as reserves, and to store those reserves safely, they invest them in United States government bonds. This means that the American government has had a permanent and structural buyer for its debt sitting in every major economy on the planet for 50 years. The consequence is borrowing costs that no other government on earth can access. When the United States needs to finance a deficit, it issues treasury bonds. Those bonds are purchased by central banks from Tokyo to Frankfurt to Riyadh because those central banks need somewhere to park their dollar reserves. That consistent demand keeps American interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. Lower interest rates mean the United States can carry a national debt of tens of trillions of dollars at a cost that would be impossible for any other government to sustain. It means American consumers borrow more cheaply. American businesses expand more cheaply. The American military is financed more cheaply. Every structural advantage the United States has held in the global economy for the past half-century flows directly or indirectly from this single arrangement. The petrodollar did not just help the American economy, it financed it. And it did so on a scale that is almost impossible to overstate, which is precisely why what is happening right now deserves far more attention than the daily missile count. For the petrodollar to survive, three conditions had to hold simultaneously. Remove any one of them and the entire architecture begins to crack. The first condition was a stable Gulf. The oil had to keep flowing. If the producing states became too unstable to export reliably, countries would be forced to seek alternative energy sources priced in alternative currencies. Stability in the Gulf was not just a regional interest. It was a structural requirement of the global dollar system. This is why the United States has maintained a permanent military presence in the region for decades, not purely for strategic reasons, for financial ones. The second condition was American military credibility. The original 1974 deal was a security arrangement. Saudi Arabia accepted dollar pricing because the United States guaranteed its protection. The moment that guarantee looks unreliable, the political foundation of the agreement weakens. Every oil producer watching American military performance in the region is simultaneously watching whether the deal that underpins the petrodollar still carries the weight it once did. The third condition was the absence of any viable alternative. Countries needed dollars because there was no other mechanism to buy oil, no alternative payment system, no rival currency with the institutional infrastructure to support global energy trade. As long as no credible alternative existed, the structural demand for dollars was inescapable. For 50 years, all three conditions held. The Gulf was managed. American credibility remained high enough to deter serious challenges, and alternative payment systems were too immature to be taken seriously. But right now, in real time, all three conditions are breaking down simultaneously. The Gulf is actively destabilized. American military credibility is being tested in public. And for the first time in history, alternative payment infrastructure is not a theoretical concept. It exists. It is operational. And the countries that built it are using this war to accelerate its adoption. In 2023, something happened that received almost no coverage in Western financial media. Saudi Arabia, the country whose agreement with the United States created the petrodollar system, began settling a portion of its oil exports with China in yuan, the Chinese currency, not dollars. This was not a symbolic gesture. The infrastructure that made it possible had been under construction for years. China built an alternative to the Western payment messaging system specifically designed to settle energy transactions outside of dollar-denominated networks. Saudi Arabia quietly connected to it. To understand why this matters, think about what the original 1974 deal actually was at its core. It was not an economic agreement, it was a loyalty arrangement. Saudi Arabia accepted dollar pricing in exchange for American military protection. The petrodollar was always political before it was financial. So when Saudi Arabia signs an oil contract in yuan, it is not making an accounting decision. It is sending a political signal. It is telling Washington that the loyalty underpinning the arrangement is no longer unconditional. Now consider the timing. Saudi Arabia made this move while simultaneously deepening its strategic relationship with China, pursuing BRICS membership, and publicly distancing itself from American foreign policy positions it had previously supported without question. None of these moves happened in isolation. They are components of a deliberate repositioning. Saudi Arabia is not abandoning the dollar tomorrow. It is building the infrastructure and the relationships that would allow it to abandon the dollar if and when doing so becomes strategically advantageous. The exit door is not being used yet, but it has been built, fitted, and tested, and every other oil-producing state in the world has noticed. When the country that created the petrodollar begins constructing alternatives to it, the signal to every other energy exporter is clear. The arrangement that has governed global oil pricing for 50 years is now negotiable. In February 2022, the United States and its allies froze $300 billion of Russian sovereign reserves held in Western financial institutions. From a purely military standpoint, it was a significant economic sanction. From a global financial standpoint, it was something far more consequential. It was a demonstration. For the first time in the modern era, a major power had its dollar-denominated reserves rendered inaccessible by political decision, not by market forces, not by economic performance, by a choice made in Washington. The reaction among central banks around the world was immediate and measurable. Within 12 months of the Russian reserve freeze, global central bank purchases of physical gold reached their highest level since 1967. Countries that had spent decades holding the majority of their reserves in dollars and dollar-denominated bonds began quietly diversifying, not dramatically, not publicly, but consistently and in one direction, away from the dollar. The reasoning was not complicated. If Russian reserves could be frozen, any country that found itself in political conflict with Washington faced the same risk. Holding sovereign wealth in a currency controlled by a foreign government that had demonstrated its willingness to weaponize that control was no longer a theoretical risk. It was a documented one. Now think about who was watching this most carefully. China holds the largest foreign currency reserves of any country on Earth. A significant portion of those reserves are dollar-denominated. The Russian president told Beijing directly that in a serious geopolitical confrontation with the United States, those reserves could be frozen overnight. The strategic implication was unambiguous. China accelerated its own efforts to build payment infrastructure, accumulate gold, and settle bilateral trade in yuan. The reserve freeze did not just punish Russia. It handed every country with reason to distrust Washington a concrete and undeniable argument for reducing dollar exposure, and it handed them that argument at precisely the moment when the infrastructure to act on it was becoming available. For years, Western analysts dismissed BRICS as a talking shop, a collection of large but structurally incompatible economies producing declarations that went nowhere. And for a long time, that assessment was fair. A functional alternative to the dollar requires deep and liquid bond markets, transparent legal institutions, and decades of accumulated trust from global investors. None of that can be assembled at a summit. But that framing misses what BRICS actually represents at this stage. It is not a currency. It is a political coalition organized around a single shared objective: reducing structural dependence on the dollar. And in that narrower sense, it has achieved something significant. It has converted dollar de-dollarization from a fringe idea into an explicit policy priority for economies that together account for a substantial and growing share of global output. Consider the membership expansion in 2023. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia were all invited to join. Think about what that list represents from an energy perspective. Multiple major oil and gas producers simultaneously moving inside a political coalition whose stated agenda includes building non-dollar trade infrastructure. This is not accidental. It is a deliberate assembly of the countries whose participation is necessary for any serious alternative to petrodollar pricing to function. You cannot replace dollar oil pricing without the oil producers, and the oil producers are now inside the tent. The BRICS framework does not need to produce a single unified currency to damage the petrodollar. It only needs to produce enough bilateral trade agreements, enough alternative settlement arrangements, and enough political coordination to gradually reduce the share of global energy trade that flows through dollar-denominated systems. Each percentage point reduction in dollar-denominated oil trade translates directly into reduced structural demand for dollars globally. And reduced structural demand for dollars means higher borrowing costs for the United States government and weaker purchasing power for every currency pegged to or priced against the dollar. Now bring all three cracks together and place the Iran-Israel war on top of them. The Saudi yuan deal already existed. The Russian reserve precedent already existed. The BRICS energy coalition was already assembled. What the war does is compress the timeline on all three simultaneously. Here is how that compression works in practice. Every week, the Gulf remains actively destabilized. Importing nations face pressure to diversify their energy supply chains. Diversification means new supplier relationships. New supplier relationships mean new pricing arrangements. New pricing arrangements increasingly involve non-dollar settlement because the infrastructure to support it now exists and the political will to use it has never been stronger. At the same time, every public test of American military credibility in the region gives Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states more political cover to accelerate their hedging. In a stable environment, moving away from dollar pricing carries diplomatic risk. In an unstable environment, it can be framed as prudent risk management. The war provides that framing, and the timeline compression matters enormously. Institutional transitions in global finance are normally measured in decades because the switching costs are high and the urgency is low. When a crisis raises the urgency while the switching costs have already been reduced by years of infrastructure investment, the transition can accelerate faster than any model predicted. Think about what this means for your own financial life. The petrodollar system is the reason the Swiss franc, the euro, and every other currency in the world is partially priced against the dollar's structural strength. If that structural strength erodes, the transmission into your cost of living is not theoretical. It arrives through energy prices, import costs, and the interest rate your central bank must maintain to defend its own currency's value. The war did not create this trajectory, but it may be the event that moves it from gradual to irreversible. We have seen this before, not with the dollar, but with the currency it replaced. In the early 20th century, the British pound sterling was exactly what the dollar is today. The currency in which global commodities were priced. The currency held in reserve by central banks on every continent. The currency at the center of international trade and capital flows. Britain sat at the heart of the global financial system with the same structural advantages the United States holds now, and then it did not. The transition did not happen overnight. It happened across 3 decades of accumulated stress. 2 world wars stretched British finances beyond recovery. Industrial output declined relative to American competitors. The military credibility that had underwritten British financial dominance eroded, and crucially, an alternative had been building institutional depth for years before it was ready to take the central position. By the time the pound formally lost its reserve currency status, the outcome had already been determined. The announcement was the last step in a process that insiders had understood for a generation. The question that nobody in Washington is willing to answer publicly today is whether the dollar is now inside its own equivalent period. Whether the combination of the Saudi yuan deal, the Russian reserve precedent, the BRICS energy coalition, and the active destabilization of the Gulf represents the same kind of accumulated structural stress that preceded the pound's decline. The honest answer is that no one knows with certainty. Reserve currency transitions are only fully visible in retrospect. What is visible right now in the data and in the decisions being made by central banks, energy exporters, and finance ministries across Asia and the Middle East is a clear and consistent movement in one direction, away from the dollar, gradually, then perhaps not so gradually, and that is precisely why this conflict is not simply a military story. It is a financial story, and the ending has not yet been written.